In a city that tucks its sins beneath brick and soot, some addresses don't die when the wrecking ball swings. They just change where they get their mail. From a mansion Pittsburghers whispered about as the house the devil built, to a shuttered hilltop hospital with too many doors and not nearly enough exits. For this couple, a bright afternoon promised a quick look around, but delivered a night that followed them long after they found the way out. Check-in's free, but it costs way more than you planned. Welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and become part of our ever-growing community of the curious. Now prepare yourself, because what you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story recently submitted by a handyman from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He goes by the name Dan Hartman. Thank you for letting me share this. I've told pieces of it for years, but this is the first time I'm putting it all down together. My name is Dan Hartman. I fix things for a living. Furnaces, pumps that bind, doors that sag, broken cabinets, hanging blinds. You know, handyman stuff. I've lived in or around Pittsburgh most my life. Lots of creepy stuff in these parts, and I've been in some pretty creepy and sketchy homes. Before my main story, I want to share a story my grandparents told me about a house that got demolished. One that they said pure evil lived inside. Because if there is evil out there, then what my girl and I witnessed makes way more sense. My grandmother always used to say a prayer. It went something like, "Lord, you are my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust." I didn't know what that meant back then, but I sure do now. They used to call it the Congelier house, but I heard it first as the house the devil built. My grandparents lived in that end of Manchester before the highways carved up the neighborhoods. In summer, they'd sit on the cement stoop with coffee after dinner and talk low. If I came out, they'd stop or change to baseball or something. My grandfather worked decades in the mills. He didn't like talk for talk's sake. He kept to facts. Still, when that house came up, his jaw would tighten and he'd say, "You don't tempt a place by staring at it." If you pressed him, he'd give you little details, like there was a murder. There were people who never stayed the night twice. There were noises at the top of the stairs that didn't match feet. There were lights in rooms with no power. Then it just blew up. Said it was a gas leak, but my grandfather said the ground vibrated for days afterwards. Grandma once said after the house was torn down, people still crossed the street a full block early. One day, Granddad leaned back, thumb hooked in his suspenders, and said, "They called it the house the devil built, and there's reasons for that." They say way back in 1871, the wife came home to find her husband Charles in bed with the maid. So she grabbed a meat cleaver from the kitchen, and when the neighbors finally got the door open, Lyda was rocking in a chair, holding the maid's decapitated head and humming a lullaby. Later, the railroad bought the place for its men, but they wouldn't stay long. Every night they reported the same soft weeping in the walls, footsteps, and a sound of a rocking chair creaking back and forth. Granddad then told a story of a doctor who moved in sometime after. One night there was a scream and then a white flash. Police found a body without its head and a bunch of glass jars in the basement with strange things in them. I don't remember what he said was in those jars. Granddad said, sometime later the gas company put immigrant workers in there. Even they reported hearing strange things that weren't there, like lullabies in an empty hall. And then 2 of those workers turned up dead in the cellar. Grandma swears she heard Thomas Edison himself came by with some kind of talking to ghost contraption. They said, in 1927, a gas tank down the road went up and the house went up with it. Folks said the devil finally came to claim his deed. I remember Grandma said to me, Some houses let you leave, but they never let you go. I really miss my grandparents and their great stories. There are so many old creepy places in these parts and so many stories just like the ones my grandparents told me when I was young. Like the one I'm about to tell you. Anyways, let's jump to 2005. It was early spring, gray sky, edges of snow left in the shade. My girlfriend then, Melissa, had a friend who knew the caretaker at a closed facility up in the farm fields. People around there called it Hill View or the county home. I'll keep the town out of this, but locals will know the place. Back then, no TV crews, no overnight packages, no flashlight lines moving down the hall like a parade. Just a long brick building on a rise with a bad history. We met the caretaker at the side door around noon. He was late, middle-aged, skinny but strong, with that slow way of talking people get when they've spent a lot of time listening in quiet rooms. He said, 2 floors only, and no basement, it floods, and stay together, like he was repeating lines he'd said 100 times to people who didn't listen. The door closed behind us, and the building swallowed the outside. The sound did that muffled thing like when a room is soundproofed. The air had a smell. The first floor was a grid, reception, nursing station, small rooms with numbers stenciled above, a chapel-sized room with folding chairs stacked along the wall. The light from the windows came in flat. Paint had peeled in strips long enough to curl on themselves. I noticed the floor sloped toward invisible drains in the corners. Some doors stuck and gave all at once when you leaned on them. Second floor, darker, colder. Windows boarded here and there. In a larger room, we found files. Not a neat cabinet, just a spill on the floor like someone had dropped them and no one had the right to pick them up. I sat cross-legged and read intake notes from the 80s. I shouldn't have. It felt wrong. People lived in those lines. Between diagrams of bed checks and diet charts, there were drawings, circles cut by straight lines, tiny tick marks at the edges like climbing pegs. Not art, not doodles. Melissa photographed them and said, "Looks like someone's counting around a clock that doesn't have numbers." That's when the talking started, not ours. A man's voice down the hall, low and steady, the tone people use for prayer or repeating instructions to themselves. I said, "Hello?" and the voice stopped. We stepped out. The hall was empty. 2 plastic chairs that had been stacked in the room now sat facing each other in the middle of the corridor. No sound, no wind. We headed for the stairs. The hall got longer. I know that's not how buildings work, but I swear we passed the same fire exit sign twice. When the stair door finally appeared, a shape slid forward from the shadow at the far end. Tall, wrong proportions, arms too long. It leaned, not like a person, more like someone had hung a coat on a nail and the wall moved. I didn't see a face, just a darker dark with a sheen like damp fabric. Then footsteps on tactile behind us, almost sounding like bare feet, quick and quiet. We went through the door fast. We came out on the first floor, but it wasn't the lobby. It was another corridor. The smell got nasty, and there was pressure in my ears. Melissa's camera beeped on its own. The screen flashed, and then the library of images turned into black squares with a white scrape down the center, like a reflection that didn't have a source. We tried doors until one opened, and we spilled outside onto soaked ground on the wrong side of the building. The caretaker stood near his truck like he'd been waiting a while. He didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. He said, "You stuck to the first 2 floors?" We both said yes. He said, "No, you didn't." And his voice was flat like that was the end of the conversation. He didn't take the camera to see the photos. He didn't want to touch it. That would have been enough, but it wasn't the end. It was the start. A week after, I started asking around. I went into a breakfast spot near the hill and asked the waitress if she knew anyone that had a family who worked at the county home before it closed. She pointed to an older lady 2 stools down. I asked the lady if that was true. She said, "My sister cleaned their nights from 79 to 84. She took a breath and said, "They had a flood in the basement more than once. Water came up through the floor drains. They kept the doors locked because sometimes it sounded like people down there when it was empty." "People?" I asked. She added that her sister wouldn't take the elevator up from the basement after it got stuck one time and the lights went out. When they forced the door, her sister was crying. After that, she started putting Bibles in the corner rooms. Then I got another lead, a retired EMT at a VFW fish fry who said he'd been called to the building in the early 2000s for trespassers who hurt themselves. We were told to write "unknown injury" if they couldn't describe what happened. They don't like people saying the building is a problem. I also spoke to a nurse who worked there in the late 80s. She said night rounds sometimes didn't line up. You'd walk a hall and it would be 3 doors too many or 1 door too few. She said alarms would trip and stop when you reached the panel. She said there was a room where patients refused to sleep, and staff stopped assigning it unless every other room was full. On her last year there, a new orderly quit after 2 shifts because he heard someone cursing in the pipes. She said he wasn't the type to pretend. He was a big guy and didn't scare easy, she said. He left his lunch in the fridge and never came back. Melissa wanted to go back, but I didn't. I went anyway because she was shaky and trying to hide it. We drove up anyway on a Sunday afternoon and sat on the road where we could see the building but not be seen from the windows. We didn't get out of the truck. We watched a light flicker in the 3rd floor corner, even though there was no power. The flicker wasn't a bulb. It was a smear of brightness, like a reflection without a source. When we got home, the knocks changed from 2 to 3. The time stayed 3:17. The bathroom mirror fogged in a way it didn't before. I left my new phone on the dresser face down, and in the morning it had a video on it. 32 seconds of blackness. When I played it with the volume up, at second 18 there was a whisper and it said my name. I deleted it. I emptied the deleted folder. Later that day, Melissa and I went to a farmer's market where we saw the caretaker again. He was there buying eggs. He saw us and came over and said, "You shouldn't have gone back," he said. I told him we hadn't gone in. He said, "Don't stand and look at it then." He carried his eggs like a baby. He didn't invite questions. We asked anyway. He spoke low. He said there were rooms where staff stacked chairs and crosses. No one told them to. They did it because chairs seemed to migrate if they stayed straight. He said sometimes water rose in the basement drains without rain and left rings on the cinder block like a tide chart. He said one night he heard 2 men talking in the boiler room, and when he opened the door, the sound didn't stop. It changed direction like it went into the pipes. He said he'd asked for the basement to be sealed. They told me the building had to be rentable on paper, he said. You don't rent a place with a sealed basement. So we keep it unsafe for public access and pretend the problem is the stairs. The knocks stopped for 4 nights. I didn't sleep so much as drift. On the 5th night, I woke at 3:17 again. The phone on the dresser buzzed once without a call, then lit up and the camera app opened itself. The screen was dark except for a smear of shine on the edge. It was a reflection of me in the mirror, in my bed, and a tall, darker shape at the foot with a tilted head. The video stopped. When I went to delete it, it wasn't there. The thumbnail was there, but tapping it did nothing. I left the room and didn't come back for a long time. We went back. I had to try something to make all this stop. I thought I didn't have any other options. We stayed on the 1st floor. The air was still that mix of dust and old disinfectant. We walked slow. We passed the chapel room. There were stacked chairs, and one set had been crossed. It made my throat close. We heard a woman's voice down the corridor. 3 words, soft, like speaking to someone in a sickbed. We couldn't make out the words. When we turned the corner, there was no one there. At the nurse's station, the phones were dead. But when I lifted one, I heard a single tone hold steady. The basement door stood at the end of a short cross hall behind a gate with a loop chain, and a sign said, "Unsafe area. Do not enter." Water stains crept up the cinder block like a shadow. I took 2 steps back without thinking, and Melissa squeezed my wrist really hard. We turned to leave, and the hall behind us seemed longer again. We moved steady, no running. Running felt like what it wanted. At a side door, Melissa pushed the bar and we were out. It was 2:46 p.m. on my watch. We had been inside 12 minutes, but my truck clock said we'd been there an hour and a half. This was one of the strangest days of my life. Back at home, Hank started growling low at the corner where the hall meets the bathroom. I bought a second-hand camcorder and set it on a tripod in the kitchen, pointed at the hall. The first 2 nights, nothing. The third, a shadow that wasn't from a body, crossed the frame low to the floor and stopped. The camcorder glitched at 3:17:4 to 3:17:11. When playback resumed, the tripod had shifted 5 degrees left. But the sound on the tape during the missing seconds was not missing. It was a whisper. This was the worst part. One night I woke from my sleep and sat up, didn't turn on the light, and there was a whisper near my ear. It said my name twice. Then it said, "Stay." I didn't get closure for a long time. I just learned to ignore it. The knocks still came in clusters sometimes, with weeks in between. When I drove by that area for work, I didn't look up the hill. I took the long way. I moved since then, and so did Melissa. We still remain friends, and things got much better for the both of us, and I haven't had an encounter for a long time. My grandparents were right. Sometimes the brick isn't where the story ends. It moves to another corner and waits. So, this is my warning. Stay away from that old hospital. Evil lives there. And so, another strange encounter fades away. A trick of the mind, or something far more unsettling. That's for you to decide. Thank you so much for watching my stories. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support is what keeps this channel going.